A Model Gentleman. Written by Johnny Fist. Bob had long been planning to spend Friday properly. The weekend lay ahead, and he had no intention of starting it on the very day it began. Friday evening was like a sacred woman, available only once a week. That's exactly how he saw it. Even though he already had a woman who was available far more often, and who was also expecting attention on Friday night, Bob still preferred to present her with whatever remained of him after a good night out, rather than offer himself whole and sober. So after work, he headed to the bar with his friends. Barely an hour had passed since they crossed the threshold of the drinking establishment before everyone was already fairly drunk. Bob was especially enthusiastic in this matter and could hardly keep up with emptying one glass after another. Another hour later, he was dozing at the bar counter. They would wake him, pour him another drink, he'd knock it back, and promptly fall asleep again. He finally decided to wake up about 2 hours before leaving the bar, when his mobile had already been ringing non-stop with calls from his beloved, who, in increasingly heated tones, was trying to find out where the hell he was wandering around for so long. Bob felt guilty that he didn't want to leave the bar. He gave her an hour, then another hour, and another. He guaranteed that after the time he named, he'd be safely under her warm wing. Every time he hung up, he drank again with the group amid loud cheers and mockery, and then drifted back to sleep. 2 hours before closing, a pretty young woman walked into the bar carrying several bouquets of flowers. She was no fool and knew exactly when to arrive. She had nothing to fear. Everyone knew her there. She was the daughter of one of the local bar owners. But she also knew that for many men, the real problems after visiting one of the bars in the area only began once they got home. So, close to closing time, the girl would make her rounds through the bars with armfuls of flowers, selling them at a modest 60% markup. She believed a woman's forgiveness ought to cost even more. But for her age, she already understood that most men wouldn't go any higher than that. After Bob finished yet another conversation with his woman and lifted his head, he saw the girl with the flowers. Immediately the thought struck him that flowers would solve, if not all his problems, then at least many of them. So he bought some, setting them beside himself, downing another drink and blacking out again. He slept for another couple of hours before finally leaving the bar, bouquet in hand. Dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and a denim jacket, he found the evening damnably hot. Lighting a cigarette, he started walking to his beloved's place. Lone passers-by and couples approached him along the way. One way or another, they all noticed him and his slow, uneven gait. Most people smiled at him. He assumed it was because of the flowers and his good mood. They could clearly see, the devils, that a man full of the warmest feelings was on his way to his woman. True, there were a couple of women who looked lower than his waist with obvious disapproval, but that didn't bother him too much. Bob reached a crossing. The traffic light was red, and as a law-abiding citizen, he stopped to wait for his signal to continue. On the opposite side of the road stood a particularly unpleasant woman. She stared at Bob with open disgust, and her gaze wasn't fixed on his eyes or the flowers, but once again, lower down. Embarrassed, Bob looked to see what she was staring at, and what he saw was the worst thing imaginable in that situation. At crotch level there was a wet stain, darkening in a stream all the way down his trouser leg to his knee. Bob realized the stain could only mean one thing. He'd pissed himself. But when exactly he'd done it, he had no memory whatsoever, and why he hadn't gone to the toilet. And worst of all, it meant he'd walked this entire distance soaked in piss. Faces flashed before his eyes, all those people who had smiled at him along the way. They hadn't been smiling at him. They'd been laughing at the fact that a grown man had wet himself. The light changed. Bob walked on slowly. The woman from the opposite side crossed faster. As she passed him, she shouted some unintelligible insult and continued on her way. There was nowhere to escape to. The flowers had to fix all this. And as luck would have it, there wasn't a fountain or anything nearby. Normally, Bob had always been glad about that, because it kept the neighborhood quiet. But now, for the first time, he bitterly regretted it. Bob reached his beloved's house and rang the bell. She opened the door with obvious irritation. As always, she looked him up and down from heel to crown. Usually, after this ritual inspection, she'd let him inside and, while scolding him, feed him dinner. But this time her gaze stopped on the stain, clearly visible from knee to crotch, loudly proclaiming the story of its origin. For what felt like an eternity to Bob, she spoke without letting him inside. He was simultaneously ashamed and desperately in need of a piss, so badly in fact that he was ready to produce a second stain right next to the first. Gathering his courage, he interrupted her and asked to come in. The door slammed shut in his face. He and the flowers remained outside. Startled, he let out a little more, enough for a second stain to appear on the other side. Managing to clench himself in time, he hurried downstairs, threw away the flowers, and finally relaxed completely beneath the nearest tree. Well then, now there remained the journey home. Not a long one, but still a journey, this time with an additional stain. Though what difference did it make compared to before? None at all. Only now there were no flowers. Bob lit a cigarette and staggered home. One day like this was bound to happen eventually, but at least one thing was good. He'd had an excellent time with his friends, and everything else. None of that really mattered. These things happen to everyone, don't they?